Do you think in this short conversation, someone watching this, you could teach them how to be a Stoic in this short conversation?
Well, I think the first question would be, why do you want to be a Stoic? Right? It's Stoicism is, it's like any philosophy of any philosophy of life is pretty challenging. You wouldn't say, for instance, oh, let me try if I can be a Buddhist or something, or even let me try to be a Christian. I think that religions are a type of philosophy of life anyway. And so, you wouldn't do that with sort of just for the hell of it, basically. You would have to have a reason. Typically, the reason for approaching a philosophy of life is because people need a framework of some sort. They need some kind of reference point, some kind of way to navigate life and to set priorities and to feel like they're doing meaningful things, that sort of stuff. So if that's the idea, then I do think that Stoicism is one of the best ones on offer, so to speak. Although, different things work for different people. I'm not sure that, the ancient Stoics would have argued that everybody could and should be a Stoic. I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. I think there are other ways of being a good person, which is, after all, at the end of the day, that's the ultimate goal. You can be a good person by following Buddha. You can be a good person by following Christ, if you're actually following Christ, not a lot of the crap that goes under the name of Christianity these days. But then again, there's a lot of crap that goes under the name of Buddhism, and in fact, a significant amount of crap that goes under the name of Stoicism at this point. So, so long as you can separate the crap from the good stuff, then any of those choices and many other besides, right? You can be a Taoist, for instance, or a Confucian, and so on. However, Stoicism does offer a very simple, relatively speaking, and yet very powerful and coherent system or way to approach a philosophy of life. So how do you become a Stoic? Well, the answer is very simple according to the ancient Stoics, although it's deceptively so. They said that you should live according to nature. This goes back right at the beginning of Stoicism. The very first Stoic that we know of was Zeno of Citium, who was a merchant actually before he turned philosopher. And Zeno studied in ancient Athens in the 4th century BCE. He studied with a number of other philosophers, including Cynics and Platonists and Megarians and dialecticians. And then at some point, after more than a decade of doing this kind of stuff, he said, okay, I think I'm ready to start doing my own teaching. And he picked a place called, as you know, called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, which is where the word Stoicism comes from. And that was an interesting choice because on purpose, he picked something that was very close to the open market, to the agora in the middle of Athens. And so it wasn't a school like Plato's Academy, which was outside of town, or Aristotle Lyceum, or Epicurus Garden, all of which were kind of difficult to reach. You really had to have a purpose to get there. And they were kind of sort of gated communities, basically. You couldn't just walk in. The Stoics, on the other hand, they started to teach to anybody who will listen in the middle of the marketplace. And when Zeno said we should live according to nature, what he meant was that if the question is, what is a meaningful life? What is a good life for a human being? Then you need to ask yourself what kind of animal a human being is. Right. So let me give you an example, an analogy. Let's say that you invite me over for dinner one day, and I show up with my customary bottle of wine, and on top of which, however, I also bring you a gift. I bring you a cactus plant. Right. Now you're responsible for the cactus plant's well-being. Right. It's your plant now. Well, you better know something about cacti. Otherwise, you're going to kill the plant, right? So you have to know not only that cacti are plants, but that they're desert plants. And therefore, they need a lot of light, but relatively little water. If you don't know this and you say to yourself, oh, this is a plant, it wants a lot of water, then you're going to kill it, right? So in other words, in order to make sure that your cactus flourishes, that does well, you have to know something about cactus nature. Right? If you ignore cactus nature, then the cactus is probably going to die, or at the very least, it's not going to do very well. So Zeno's idea was that the same goes for human beings, that if the question is that of a eudaimonia, that is a life worth living, a life that you get to the end of it and say, oh yeah, that was pretty well done. It was not a waste of time. Then you have to ask yourself, okay, and what makes for a good life for a human being, as opposed to, a chimpanzee or a cactus or a dog or anything else? The Stoics answered that question very specifically. They thought that there are a number of things that we share with other animals, right? So we need shelter, we need food, we need water, we have an instinct for having sex and babies, that sort of stuff. That, however, is not specifically human. It's something that we share with a lot of other animal species. So all those things are, of course, necessary, but they're not sufficient to give you this idea of what a good human life would be. After all, if I were to tell you that your entire life would be just a question of having a roof over your head, enough water and food, and then occasionally sex, I don't know that you'd be very happy about it. You'd say, well, okay, that's the minimum. That's a good starting point, right? But what else, right? And that the answer to the question, what else, is what really makes for interesting discussion. So the Stoics' answer to the what else question was two things. They thought that human beings were given by nature two characteristics. One, we're capable of reason. That doesn't mean we always reason well. It just means we're capable of it if we put ourselves to it. And two, we're highly social animals. So the combination of those two things, high sociability and high degree of rationality, or at least potential rationality, are the two things that really characterize human nature. And therefore, the Stoics concluded that a good human life is one in which you reason well, to the best of your abilities, and you act pro-socially. That is, you cooperate with other people in order to make the world a better place for everybody. And that's pretty much it. That is the core of Stoicism. So if you want to be a Stoic, what you need to do is to improve your reasoning and act pro-socially. And how specifically you do that, of course, you can do it in a number of ways, and the Stoics do give pretty good suggestions on how to do that. But fundamentally, if somebody were to say, so how do I live a life like a Stoic? I would say improve your reasoning and act pro-socially, and that's pretty much it.
Right, that's quite simplified. So it's not about shutting off your emotions. It's not about being an island, being isolated. One thing I wanted to clear before we get deeper into this is who can be a Stoic?
So I want to say anyone, but that's not quite true. Anyone, meaning that it doesn't matter whether you are a man or woman or other gender. It doesn't matter whether you are white or black or Hispanic or whatever. It doesn't, none of those things are actually relevant. Whether you are educated or not also is irrelevant to be a Stoic. But you do have to have a somewhat functional human brain. If your mind doesn't work well, then you might have trouble being a Stoic. If the dysfunction is mild, like for instance, you suffer from a mild degree of depression, or you're bipolar, let's say, but it's manageable with medications, things like that, then you can certainly still practice as a Stoicism. But if your mind is way out there, that is, it's incapable of functioning within the sort of broad normal range of human functionality, then you're going to have a problem. But it's not like you're going to have a problem just with Stoicism. You're going to have a problem with everything. And so the analogy, I know people don't like to hear this because they immediately, I've heard people say, oh, but that discriminates against people that have mental disorders. Like, it's not a question of discrimination. Let me put it this way. To use an analogy that the Stoics often come up with, they analogize practicing philosophy to going to practice athletics, right? Now, what do you need in order to go to the gym, to be able to go to the gym? A normally physical body, right? Functioning body. If you have a broken leg, I'd rather you not show up at the gym, or at least you're going to do only the things that are possible, only the kinds of exercises that are possible for somebody with a broken leg. If you're completely in pieces, if a bad accident happened to you and your spine is gone or something like that, it's in pieces, then no, don't come to the gym, because it's not a question of discrimination. It's what are you going to do, right? You cannot function, and therefore you cannot take. In fact, not only you cannot function, but probably you're going to hurt yourself further if you don't pay attention to that kind of stuff, right? Now, within that those broad parameters, however, there is a lot of room, right? It's not like only people who are capable of becoming Olympic athletes go to the gym. Anybody can go to the gym, right? Even if you are out of shape and getting older, and you haven't exercised that much before, still you can still do it. You will not get to the Olympic Games by doing that, but you will improve, right? So that's the answer, I think, to who can practice Stoicism. I think potentially anyone, but you have to have a certain minimum number of requirements, and that requirement is a more or less functioning mind. If your mind is not functional, then you need first help with that, psychiatry, psychology, therapy, whatever it is, and then once your mind is back to a more or less functional range, then you can start doing everything else.
A quick word from our sponsor, Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, I remember I was talking to someone about these types of people that can't learn Stoicism or can't be Stoic, and he reached a conclusion that Stoicism is still beneficial for them, because if the people around them are practicing Stoicism, then they would also be helping them. Do you agree?
Yeah, sure, of course. But that's because Stoicism is inherent, as we said before, is inherently pro-social. So one of the things you have to, one of the duties of a Stoic is to take care of other people, especially if other people cannot take care of themselves. So yes, in that sense, everybody can benefit, but that's a different question from everybody can practice.
Yeah.
So those are two distinct questions. And absolutely, yes. If society were made of people who practice Stoicism on a regular basis, I think it would be much better off. For everybody would be much better off, even the ones that were not actually practicing. Yeah.
Yeah. So how you went from biology to, how did you manage to find Stoicism in your life?
It was in part the result of a kind of a systematic search, and in part it was pure chance, pure serendipity. So what happened? This was a number of years ago. I was going through a pretty normal midlife crisis. A couple of major things that happened that I had a little bit of difficulty to deal with, and so I paused and I thought, I think I need some kind of new direction here. I need some, up to that point, my life had been pretty smooth and straightforward, and career-wise, in terms of personal relationships, etc. But then I kind of hit this issue, a couple of issues, and I thought, now I need directions. Now I need something or somebody to help me out here. And because at the time, it also happened that at the time I was already studying philosophy more seriously. I was in biology, as you were saying. I was a professional biologist, but I was studying philosophy. So I thought, well, surely philosophy is going to be capable of giving me some kind of answer. And so I actually started exploring systematically a number of possible philosophies of life. I started with Buddhism, in fact. And I found it very interesting, especially Buddhist ethics is very interesting. The notion of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment and all that sort of stuff. However, Buddhism didn't really speak to me. There was something special about the metaphysics, the background metaphysics, that I just couldn't bring myself to kind of embrace. And so I said, okay, that's interesting, but let's move on. And so I was in the process of exploring a number of other possibilities, including especially the focus immediately became ancient Greco-Roman philosophy. So Aristotle, Epicurus, things like that. And then one day, and this is the serendipitous part, I was on Twitter at the time, was called, not X, and I saw this thing that said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week," and I thought, Stoic Week, the hell is that? And why would anybody want to celebrate the Stoics? Because at the time, like a lot of people, I had a couple of misconceptions about the Stoics. I thought that Stoicism was about suppressing emotions and going through life with a stiff upper lip. And I thought, that doesn't sound very, very appealing. Why would anybody want to celebrate? In fact, the whole idea of celebrating Stoicism seems like an oxymoron. It seems like a contradiction. But then I thought, wait a minute, hold on. Stoicism is also a Greco-Roman philosophy. That much I knew. And then I started, so it's in the ballpark of the kind of stuff that I was already interested in. So maybe I should take a look at it. And then I remember, wait a minute, Stoicism, well, that's Seneca. And Seneca, I translated Seneca in high school when I was, from Latin, because it's sort of exercises in Latin. And then I thought, wait, it's also Marcus Aurelius, whose birthday, by the way, it is today. And I thought, Marcus Aurelius, when I was in college, I read Meditations. So it's like, okay, maybe this Stoicism stuff is more interesting than I remember. So I did sign up for Stoic Week, which is organized still today, to this day, by the Modern Stoicism organization, people like Donald Robertson and John Sellers and Chris Gill and so on and so forth. And in fact, now I'm on the board of that organization, as it turns out. So now I am one of the co-organizers of Stoic Week and StoicCon every year. But at the time, so I just signed up and I followed the instructions, which essentially told you how to live like a Stoic for a week. And basically what that means is you start reading something about Stoicism, both kind of background material and primary texts. And then you try, every day there was a different theme, and you try to live according to what the Stoics would have done. And the very first thing that I read that year about Stoicism was excerpts from Epictetus's discourses. And it immediately struck me as obviously relevant to my life. And I said, wait a minute, who the hell is this guy and why have I never heard of him? I mean, by that time, I had taken graduate level courses in philosophy, including courses in ancient philosophy, and I never heard of Epictetus. It's like, how is that even possible? And then I realized that Epictetus was actually a very famous, very, very well-known philosopher up until the 19th century. And then it kind of sort of slid temporarily into obscurity in the beginning of the 20th century. And so it's not taught in most, it wasn't at least until recently. Now things are changing. Now I am teaching ancient philosophy courses, and I do include Epictetus in the syllabus. So Epictetus really spoke to me. He said, one of the very first things that I read by him is a bit in the beginning of the discourses where he's talking about money with some of his students. And he said, yeah, sure, money, it's a thing that has value. You can do things with money, and you can do good things with money, and you can do bad things with money. And then he paused and he said, now, what is it going to tell you whether to do a good thing or a bad thing? The money itself isn't going to tell you. It's your prohairesis, and that's the first time that I encountered that term. Prohairesis means volition. It's your will. It's your ability to make decisions that is going to determine whether you're going to use the money rightly or wrongly. And I thought, that's interesting. That's an interesting insight. We tend to, basically what he was saying was like, we tend to think that so-called externals, things like money, health, wealth, reputation, career, all these things. These are, the Stoics call them externals because they are outside of ourselves, right? And we tend to think, without thinking too much, I guess, that those are goods, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be healthy and wealthy and educated and have a good reputation, etc. And contrary-wise, who doesn't want to avoid being sick or poor or having a bad reputation and so on and so forth, right? It looks like a no-brainer. It's like, well, of course. But the Stoic genius was like, no, all of those things are neither good nor bad. They just are. They're things. But they're neither good nor bad. What makes them good or bad is how you use them. And therefore, it's your prohairesis, it's your volition. And therefore, the only thing that it's really good is good prohairesis. And the only things that it's really bad is bad prohairesis. And so all of a sudden, the Stoics have completely done away with our normal value set of values, and they turn it around completely. It's like, no, it's not the external world that is valuable. It's your decisions that are valuable, regardless of what the external world is. You can be a good person and living a meaningful life, even if you're sick, poor, and uneducated. And you can live a really horrible life, even if you are wealthy and healthy and educated. And so it's like, oh, wow. So that means that your happiness, if by happiness you mean, how content you are with your life, how satisfied you are with your life, it entirely depends on you. It doesn't, we tend to think that it depends on externals, right? So I'm going to be, you said at the beginning of our conversation, oh, you've done pretty well. You lived in Rome and New York, two of the best cities in the world. The Stoics would say, no, he didn't. That was just chance. He grew up in Rome, and that was complete chance. It was my decision to come to New York, so that was not by chance. But the thing that is valuable is not New York itself; is the fact that I decided to come here. Right? It was my decision, not the external circumstances. And of course, the external circumstances do limit the amount of your decisions. You cannot just decide whatever you want and pick up and do it. You have to work within the constraints of the outside world. And that, according to Epictetus, is what makes for a good Stoic. That regardless of the external circumstances, you can still make good decisions. He used an interesting analogy there. He said that we should live life in the way in which Socrates played ball. Now, we don't know whether Socrates actually played ball, but what Epictetus meant was that when you play ball, let's say soccer, as the Americans call it, or football, as the rest of the world calls it. When you play ball, the important thing is not the ball. The ball can be of different shapes and colors and materials, and it doesn't matter. What matters is how the skill that you play with, right? So the ball is just what you use in order to actually exercise your skill. And according to Epictetus, that's how Socrates lived his life. That is, the fact that he was in Athens instead of Sparta didn't matter. The fact that he was, with certain people rather than others, or that he participated in certain events rather than others, that was irrelevant. That was immaterial. What was important is that whatever was happening to him, he was playing ball with skill.
Yes. So what did Stoicism do for you? Like, you discovered it, and then you decide to get so involved. You're massively involved in Stoicism. You wrote so many books on Stoicism, and you're teaching Stoicism. Why did that happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Stoicism really literally changed my life. I think for the better, but not just my personal life. That's what happens to a lot of people. A lot of people that encounter Stoicism. In fact, I often receive letters or emails from people that have read my books or looked at my lectures or something like that, and they say, "Oh, thank you for that, because it introduced me to something that has changed things for the better." So for most people, Stoicism changes their lives in that sense. Their personal, way of doing things and looking at things. In my case, it changed pretty much everything. Because I'm a teacher, it became natural for me to start shifting to teach from what I was doing before, which was philosophy of science, to now most of the courses that I teach here at City College are about ancient practical philosophy. Not necessarily only Stoicism, but certainly a lot of it is Stoicism or related philosophies. Because I write, and I've always written quite a bit since I was very young, that now almost all of my writings are about Stoicism. And that is because I think that Stoicism can be helpful to other people. So when I was writing before on other topics, let's say, when I was a scientist, of course, I was publishing papers, technical papers in science, and occasionally I was also writing science for a general public, for magazines for a general public. And it was fun, but it's not like it changed anybody's lives. It's not like nobody ever wrote to me and said, "Hey, I read that paper that you published on gene environment interactions, and it really changed my life." It's like occasionally a graduate student would write and say, "Hey, thanks for writing that paper because that was actually useful for my thesis." But being useful for your thesis is not the same as being useful for your life in general. By contrast, once I started writing and teaching about Stoicism, I got just a couple of these testimonials just this morning before talking to you. So I get these feedback, which really is interesting to me because it means that I'm actually helping other people. So Stoicism here is not just help me overcome the midlife crisis that I mentioned earlier, and and put my life back on a better course. It's also helping other people through the fact that I write about it, I teach about it, I talk about it pretty much to anybody who wants to listen.
That's awesome. I mean, I would just like to say this book here, that actually helped me a lot. It was one of the first books I read on Stoicism because I was kind of drawn to the practical nature of it, and it was probably the first time I had ever seen a practical take on Stoicism. Whereas before I was just kind of soaking in Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, which I guess are quite practical, especially Epictetus. But this was like gave you frameworks and exercises to follow, and it was very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. See, that's exactly what I meant. That book was interesting because I think still today it's kind of a unique thing. I mean, as you know, now there's a pretty good number of books on Stoicism. When I started out, there were relatively few. I early on, other than the classics, of course, but books on modern Stoicism. When I started out, there was like one or two, maybe by Don Robertson, one by Bill Irvine. There were a few. It was a smatter of things. And if you did a search on Stoicism online, you would come up with a certain number, good number of hits, but nothing like what you do today. Today, if you just put Stoicism into Google, it's like you're immediately overwhelmed. And frankly, most of it, unfortunately, is not very good quality. But that's the price of success, right? That's the thing. Once an idea, in this case, Stoicism, becomes popular and people want more, then the floodgates are open. But these days, you can find a lot of books on Stoicism, and yet I think, at least, I haven't come across anything that is quite like the book that you just mentioned, because it is in fact very practical. It's got this idea of the Stoics, the ancient Stoics, engage in something called ascesis, which means practice, and sometimes it's referred. These things are referred to as spiritual exercises, which is a term that actually comes from the Christian tradition. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits, wrote this book in the 1500s called Spiritual Exercises. But the interesting thing is that he himself got the idea from an earlier tradition that goes all the way back to Stoicism. So it's not a Christian invention. It's actually a Stoic thing. Although some other Greco-Roman philosophers also had, including the Epicureans, had developed a set of what we call spiritual exercises. So we thought with my friend Greg that there was just nothing out there that would systematically go through these exercises. Everybody talks about Stoicism as a practical philosophy, but then a lot of the time what you get when you open a book on Stoicism is a little bit of history, a little bit of philosophy, maybe a nudge or two toward the practical stuff, but you don't get anything systematic. It's like, but how do I actually practice? What does it mean to do an exercise? And so we figured, okay, let's dig into the literature and see what's out there. And we pared it down. That the original number of exercises was actually larger than the one we ended up publishing. But it's like 52 different exercises. So if you want to, you could practice one exercise a week for a whole year. And I know some people who have. People do write to me and say, "Oh yeah, I did the whole set." Although what I recommend is there's a shortcut right at the beginning of the book. We actually suggest that if you don't want to commit initially to do that much work, because I understand that that's a commitment, then you might there's a little bit of a cheat sheet right at the beginning where it says, okay, here are the exercises that we think are much more important, and those are, start with those and then see what happens.
Yeah, I'd just like to mention for audio listeners that the book is called Live Like a Stoic by Massimo Pigliucci and Gregory Lopez. Just so people, and that's what it looks like, just so people know what we're talking about. But I remember I was actually reading Epictetus yesterday, and I'm going to misquote him, but he said, you are no longer a child, you're an adult now. You claim to know the doctrines, so use them. I think I've got that completely wrong. But yeah, he's basically saying, like, you're listening to all this stuff, but actually, are you doing it? Now is the time. What do you think is the importance of actually practicing Stoicism? Because I know a lot of people, like myself at the start, that was just reading Stoicism, thinking about it, but I wasn't actually listening to what these people are saying and going, right, today I'm going to do this. It was only actually until I read your book where I started putting things in practice.
Yeah. Well, look, yeah, Epictetus says something on the lines of what you just mentioned multiple times, actually, right? It says, he says to his students at some point, okay, so you know the theory, but if you don't actually put it into practice, you're wasting your time, and more importantly, you're wasting my time. At the end of the Enchiridion of the manual, he says, okay, the Olympic Games have started and you're already behind. So what are you waiting for? You don't wait until, oh yeah, I'll start tomorrow. It's like, why tomorrow? What are you waiting? It's like I find it always pretty funny when people engage in things like New Year's resolutions, right? So come New Year, I'm gonna eat more healthy, or I'm gonna go to the gym, or I'm gonna stop smoking. So wait a minute, you realize that all those things are good for you. Why the hell are you waiting to get started? It's November, let's say, and you're saying, oh, next month I'm going to do these kind of things. Like, no, do it now. But if you realize that this is important, it's a good thing for you. Why do you need to wait a arbitrary date? But back to your question about sort of theory and practice, here's one way to look at it. The difference between somebody who is just interested in Stoicism or in philosophy generally, but doesn't practice, and somebody who actually does practice is similar, I think, to the difference between somebody who appreciates music but doesn't have any interest in playing an instrument, right? Most people just like to listen to music. They don't necessarily start up, a band, or they don't pick up an instrument and start playing on their own. The practitioner, on the other hand, of Stoicism is somebody who says, "Oh, this is great. It's interesting. Now let me pick up, the flute or the saxophone or the whatever it is, and let's start playing. It doesn't matter that I don't play particularly well. Important thing is that I play, right, and then I make progress. That I actually improve. So I don't think there is anything wrong with just appreciating music for the sake of music, just like there is nothing wrong in reading philosophy for intellectual pleasure, right? So it's like plenty of people pick up a book and open it up and say, "Oh, that's interesting," and then they put it down, and it hasn't changed their lives. That they move on to something else. That's fine. But if you're talking about if you're taking Stoicism seriously, then you really do need to go through that extra step and say, okay, and how is that going to change? Or a similar analogy, perhaps less flattering, might be with people who are interested in sports but don't practice sports, right? So somebody who watches soccer on television but doesn't actually pick up a ball. Okay, sure, you can do that. I do that. I appreciate the aesthetics of the game, and I watch a game, but really, it would be better if you actually also, the two are obviously not mutually exclusive, right? In order to practice, you also want to have some kind of appreciation for the game. So you don't have to, you don't have to practice in order to appreciate the game, but it certainly makes a whole different it's a whole different perspective if you don't just watch something or listen to something, but you also actually pick it up and do it. And that's the extra step that a Stoic practitioner makes. Of course, the disanalogy there is that if you do start practicing Stoicism, it has a potential to change your life, which practicing a musical instrument doesn't necessarily do the same thing, or pick up the ball in your backyard. That doesn't necessarily change your life. On the other hand, starting practicing Stoicism probably will.
So to get good at football, you need to practice football. To get good at living like a Stoic, you have to live like a Stoic.
Yes, I would say you cannot really consider yourself a student of Stoicism unless you actually practice.
Okay.
If you just read about it, it's like then you are somebody who is interested or curious about Stoicism, who might appreciate the general ideas, but if you don't actually put it into practice, then you cannot possibly consider yourself a Stoic.
Would you be like one of Epictetus's students, wasting his time?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So if you come to me and follow, and take one of my courses or read one of my books, but then you don't practice this, then I feel like I failed. Right.
Okay.
Okay. Well, but
I can't imagine you to be not bullying your students, but I feel like Epictetus was quite sarcastic with his students.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I don't do that kind of, I don't use that kind of approach, but it is kind of interesting. Yes, Epictetus is definitely no nonsense and kind of in your face with his students, right? He berates his students on a regular basis and says, you slave, what are you doing here? You're wasting my time. Yeah, that is not the way we do things anymore, but it's kind of has its own old-fashioned charm. I have a colleague at Fordham University, Brian Johnson, who has actually written a very good book on Epictetus's role ethics. And he likes to imagine Epictetus as Rocky's trainer from the movie. There's a clip on YouTube that you can go and check out, where when the trainer snaps at Rocky and says, "You've been wasting your time," and Rocky's taken aback and says, "Well, I have a job. It's a job." And the trainer says, "It's not a job. It's a waste of your life." And he sounds like what I imagine Epictetus might have sounded like. So if you want to have some idea what Epictetus might have come across like, then go and check that YouTube clip, because I think it gives you a good idea.
Yeah, I've got a good picture in my head now of Epictetus going around. One idea of Stoicism I find really interesting, and I believe Seneca says these men that made these discoveries are not our masters, they are our teachers. I feel like you're the best person to explain this whole concept so someone could understand it.
Yeah, that is actually one of my favorite quotes as well from Seneca. What he's saying there is that, look, Stoicism is open to revision, and it has to be open to revision. If we discover new things, in fact, the quote that you just mentioned continues, and it says, if we discover new and better ways to do things, then it behooves us to actually follow those new ways, regardless of what the ancients were doing. So when he says, those that preceded us are our teachers, not our masters, he means literally what he says. That is, they're not your masters. Epictetus is not my master. It's not somebody who I follow slavishly and with no questioning, right? He's a teacher, and you're supposed to question your teacher. In fact, at some point, the mark of a good student is to begin to question their teacher and perhaps do even better than their teachers, right? But if you just limit yourself to follow blindly whatever your teacher does, and you treat the teacher as a master, as somebody who has complete control over what you do, then I think you're missing the point. One of the reasons I like that quote is because one of my ongoing projects is trying to update Stoicism for the 21st century. And I find comfort in that quote, because it means that the Stoics themselves realized that things needed to be updated, needed to be changed. I mean, after all, Stoicism got started, as I said, with Zeno of Citium in the 4th century BCE. So it's been 25 centuries. In the meantime, we've learned a thing or two about how the world works. both philosophy and especially science have made a lot of progress in the intervening centuries. So it would be really bizarre if the Stoics got everything right. Right. And like, so for instance, one of my sort of ongoing discussions is with a group of modern Stoics who label themselves traditional Stoics. And they think that in order to be a Stoic, you really have to believe everything that the ancient Stoics believed. And therefore, you have to be a pantheist, for instance. So you have to believe that the universe is a living organism endowed with reason. And you call that God. And I look at this thing and I said, no, I don't think so. The modern scientific perspective does not support the notion that the world, the cosmos itself is a living organism. I'm a biologist. I know what a living organism looks like. And it doesn't look like the universe. I'm sorry. So, now the universe has generated the ability to reason. We are an obvious example. And if there are other intelligent civilizations out there in the universe, then those would be additional examples. But the universe itself doesn't think. It's not the kind of thing that thinks. In fact, it's not a thing at all. It's a set of processes, of dynamic processes. And there is no reason to think that it thinks. So that part of Stoicism, ancient Stoicism, has to go. And frankly, I find the whole idea of that we should stick to whatever the ancients believed, not only unstoic, so to speak. The Seneca, as you mentioned, says, you should update things as new stuff comes up. But I also find it's sort of untenable and a little bit ridiculous. I mean, we could have a serious discussion, for instance, about whether the universe is endowed with the logos, with reason or not. Some modern philosophers kind of sort of think that way. There are some of my colleagues who advance a notion that's called panpsychism, according to which the ability to think is basic to matter, and so in a very real sense, then everything is thinking, including the cosmos. I think that's nonsense, quite frankly. But we could have a discussion, and this it would become very quickly a very technical discussion. Because these people are philosophers, and so it would get very complicated very quickly. But we could have that discussion. But there are other notions that the ancient Stoics had about which there is no discussion. For instance, the ancient Stoics believed in divination. The ability to look at the entrails of an animal and predict the future. I hope we can all agree that that's nonsense. That's gone. It's not. It was a thing at the time. In fact, even at the time, it was criticized. Cicero, who was not a Stoic, but was usually Stoic friendly, he wrote a whole book called On Divination, where he blasts the Stoics for these things. Like, what the hell are you guys doing? This is nonsense. Why are you believing this kind of thing? Here's another example. The ancient Stoics thought, I mentioned earlier the Prohairesis, right? So the faculty of volition, the faculty of judgment. Well, they thought that this faculty resided in an actual organ, which they call the hegemonikon. The hegemonikon is what Marcus Aurelius calls the ruling faculty. Okay, so the seat of the ruling faculty. And guess where they put it? In the heart. And he's like, no, I'm sorry. The heart has nothing to do with your ability to think and to tend to make judgments. It's in the brain. In fact, modern neuroscientists would say that something like the hegemonikon is in the frontal lateral parts of your brain, those that are in charge of what is called the executive function of the human brain. We know what it is, and we know where it is. It's in the brain. It's not in the heart. So, if somebody tell me that in order to be a real Stoic, I have to believe in divination and I have to believe that the heart is the seat of the ruling faculties, like, that's nonsense. They just got it wrong. They were human beings. I mean, come on. So it's perfect. It should be perfectly fine for us to say, no, certain things they did not get right, and it is up to us to improve them. All of this does bring up, however, a serious, interesting question, which is, okay, but how much change does it take? And then you're not talking Stoicism anymore. In other words, if you keep changing things, right, over thousands of years, at some point, what you get is something that doesn't really resemble the original, right? It's something completely different. And that's a good question. And I don't think there is a particularly good answer to where the demarcation line is. I mean, if my thinking is, I take a broad view of the issue, and I say that if my thinking and practice, and especially my practice, is inspired by the historical Stoicism, then it's Stoicism. I don't care. If you don't want to call it Stoicism, you want to call it something else, fine, go ahead. Who cares, right? Nothing actually hinges on using the word or not. But this is not typical just of Stoicism. I mean, people practice Buddhism today in a way that has fairly little to do with the original Buddhism. For instance, Buddhism, first of all, we should talk probably of Buddhisms in the plural, because there are so many different traditions within Buddhism, right? Some of which include gods and others don't. Now, that seems to me a major difference. So who is the real Buddhist? The one that worships gods, or the one that doesn't? I mean, they both think of themselves as Buddhists. Or even Christianity, I mean, even though there are nutcases here in the United States who claim to be fundamentalists and originalists and all that sort of stuff, nobody really practices Christianity as it was practiced 2,000 years ago. Certainly, nobody practices, what's in the Bible. When the Bible literally, the Old Testament especially, literally says that you should stone your children to death if they disobey you. Do you know anybody who does that kind of stuff today? I mean, not even the most fundamentalist Christian would do that. So if you want to apply the criterion of unless you believe everything they believe, then you're not a Christian, then there are no Christians out there. And yet Christianity has 2.4 billion followers, is the major religion in the world. So you see what I'm talking about. It doesn't, there is what philosophers call a family resemblance between ancient Christianity and modern Christianity, between ancient Buddhism and modern Buddhism, between ancient Stoicism and modern Stoicism. There is some of the basic ideas are there, but they're changed, they're different. Some stuff has been dropped, other stuff has been introduced. That's how human cultural evolution works. And, if you're not happy and you don't want to call it Stoicism, go ahead. I'm happy with that label, so I'll keep using it.
So, Seneca, this idea that Seneca had, that obviously like Stoicism's evolving and growing with the times, was did the original Stoics, did any of them mention the same concept?
We don't know whether they mentioned the same concept, but they should, because for one thing, we don't have a lot of documentation from the early Stoics. As you know, most of the written texts in Stoicism come from the three big Roman Stoics, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Then there is something by Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus' teacher. Then there are fragments from Hierocles, who was also, however, a 2nd century Roman. So most of the stuff comes from the Roman period of the Stoa, not the Greek period. We only have very few fragments from the early scholars of the Stoa, from Zeno, from Cleanthes, from Chrysippus, from Diogenes of Babylon. All those people, it's just like we have very little. But we do have doxographers, which those are people who comment on certain traditions, like Diogenes Laertius. Right. So Diogenes Laertius wrote this book called The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers. And one of the chapters of that book, chapter 7, is entirely devoted to Stoicism. And a lot of what we know of ancient Stoicism comes from there, before the Romans. And so, for instance, Diogenes lists the titles of the books published by Chrysippus. We don't have, unfortunately, anything that Chrysippus wrote, and we only have very tiny little fragments, but at least we know what he was interested in, because we had the titles of his books. Thanks to Diogenes. Now, doxographers like Diogenes do tell us something about the lives and the philosophical discussions that these people had. And so we know that even the early Stoics had major disagreements among themselves. For instance, we know that Cleanthes disagreed with both Chrysippus and Zeno about certain fairly major tenets of ancient Stoicism. We know that they disagree on the scope of the phrase that we started this conversation with, living according to nature. Well, meaning what? Some of them thought only human nature, some of them referred to cosmic nature, and some of them referred to both of those things. So there were disagreements. And in fact, there were some major disagreements occasionally. We know of Stoics, for instance. So the ancient Stoics thought that in order to live a good life, which is the province of the study of ethics, you have also to think well, and that's the province of logic. So you have to study logic, and you have to know something about how the world works. That's the province of what they call physics, or what we would today from physis, which means nature. So the study of nature, what we would today call science. But some of the ancient Stoics said, no, we don't really need logic and physics. We just need ethics. And that was a major disagreement among some of the Stoics. Some of the ancient Stoics refer to externals as preferred or dispreferred indifference. So things like money, education, reputation, etc. They are indifferent, meaning not that you don't care, but meaning that they literally do not make a difference to the only thing that is important, which is your practice of virtue. Right. So if you're poor or rich, that doesn't make you a more or less virtuous person. So it's indifferent in that sense. It really makes no difference, right? But then they also said, and then some of these things have value, right? So they can be preferred or dispreferred. Some of the ancient Stoics disagreed. They said, no, prefer or disprefer is my ass. These things are actually important, and which would turn them basically into Aristotelians. And so we have evidence from Diogenes Laertius and from other doxographers of disagreements within the Stoa. And that those disagreements on issues of doctrine go back almost to the beginning. So we know that the Stoicism has always been a dynamic thing. It's always been a dynamic entity. It has always evolved. The Middle Stoics, for instance, Panicius and Posidonius, who lived during the period of transition where the Stoa moved from Athens to Rome, they also had different opinions about this stuff from the early Stoics. They were much more practically oriented. They emphasized the ethics, and they decreased the emphasis, but did not eliminate entirely the emphasis on logic and physics. So we have very, very good evidence that the Stoics have always had discussions among themselves about things, which means that they were open to changing their minds about stuff. Seneca is the one that actually literally puts it out there and says, not only this is a thing that has happened, it's actually a good thing that should happen.
A quick word from our sponsor, Huel. Huel is a quick, affordable, nutritiously complete food with everything that your body needs. I really like Huel. When I was writing my book, I was using Huel to power me through every single day. When I had my daily greens, when I had my meals, when I had my shakes, it stopped me from going to the shop, buying a load of rubbish, buying a load of unhealthy food, wasting loads of money. And these things do add up. Those quick journeys to the shop every day, the money adds up, the unhealthy foods add up, the wasted time adds up. So if I ever get those cravings, I grab a Huel and it fills my cravings. I feel good, it tastes delicious, it's quick and easy. And if you have any interest in the Huel products, then check the link in the description. Let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, because I was just thinking these people that say they follow Stoicism and they're only going to stick to Stoicism and not adapt, they're kind of going against Stoicism.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is to incorporate some elements of skepticism into my own brand of Stoicism, because specifically what it's called academic skepticism, the kind of skepticism that was practiced in Plato's Academy at some point. And one of the major examples of that kind of practice that we have is Cicero, who as I said, was very Stoic friendly, but he didn't consider himself a Stoic. And why would you want to put in some skepticism? Because sometimes the Stoics can be a little bit dogmatic. They can say, okay, here's how things work. The skeptics, on the other hand, by their very nature, stay away from dogmatism. And they would say, here's how it looks like things are, but I'm open to change. Cicero says it very, very clearly in multiple places. He says, look, one of the advantages of being an academic skeptic is that I can change my mind about things. He says, if a new argument comes in or if new evidence comes in, then I'm going to change my mind. I reserve the right to change my mind and follow whatever the facts and the arguments go. I don't have to just say something just because I consider myself, having allegiance to a particular school. So my own version of modern Stoicism incorporates some aspects of skepticism. It's still mostly Stoicism because it still has most of the tenets of Stoicism. I do think that the Stoics got it right in terms of human nature. I do think that I like their idea of cosmopolitanism and the emphasis on the fact that that we live in one universe, a human family, and therefore we should be concerned about the welfare of every other human being, not just those that happen to be near us. I certainly follow Epictetus's fundamental rule, which is sometimes referred to as the dichotomy of control these days. The notion that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and then a good life consists in focusing on the things that are up to us because that's where our agency lies, and at the same time developing an attitude of acceptance and equanimity toward the things that are not up to us because, what else are you going to do? They're not up to you, so you can't do anything about it. So all of those things are Stoic. They're not skeptic. And because the core of what I believe in practice is essentially Stoic, then I consider myself a Stoic. But I do like a little bit of an infusion on skepticism and moving Stoicism from a dogmatic philosophy to a probabilistic philosophy, to what in modern parlance is referred to sometimes as a fallibilist philosophy, meaning that you acknowledge from the get-go that you could be wrong. So here's what I think, but I could be wrong. Instead of here's what I think, and that's the end of that. That's the end of the story.
Yeah, I feel like in maybe a few hundred years' time, someone will be on a podcast explaining the transfer of Stoicism, the changes. They'll go, Posidonius did this, Cleanthes and Marcus Aurelius, and they'll say, Massimo introduced skepticism, and that's where it shifted. What gaps are you seeing in Stoicism that need updating? Is there certain things that you're actively trying to figure out or work on at the moment?
Yeah, I've written a number of essays about this thing on and off during the years about how to update Stoicism. In fact, I have a newsletter on Substack which is called Figs in Winter, and just a few months ago I ran a 7-part series about how updating Stoicism, which starts out with what the ancient Stoicism looked like, because if you want to update something, you might want to start from having a good idea, clear idea of what the starting point was. And then I went through different attempts by modern people. It's mostly my colleague Lawrence Baker, who's now passed away, but he was the author of A New Stoicism, which was one of the most important modern Stoicism books out there. They came out pretty early on, 1997, I think. So I go through those, and then at the end of the series, I put forth some of my own ideas about what needs to be updated and how. I'm kind of toying with the idea of actually enlarging this project, expanding this project, and actually writing a book about, how to go systematically through Stoicism and sort of and improve things. But by and large, I think that if we go back to the 3 major areas that the Stoics were interested in, ethics, science, as we would call it today, and logic, I think there is very little improvement that needs to be made in terms of logic. In fact, none at all. Stoic logic is still sound today. We still study it. It's sometimes referred to as propositional logic or zero order logic. It's considered the foundation for any other more complex logic. If you just take an introductory course in logic, you would start with Aristotle, and then you move to propositional logic, which is basically Stoic logic, though you may not be told that it's Stoic logic, but it is Stoic logic. And then you move on to more complex things. Now, for everyday life, you don't need to go any more complex than Stoic logic. Propositional logic just still works perfectly fine. So if you want to have a basic understanding of how to think soundly, pretty much you can stick with the original Stoic logic, maybe integrate it a little bit with modern discoveries in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, for instance. The discovery of a series of cognitive biases in human beings. That's useful. But it's not going to change things dramatically. It's basically just the Stoic system updated a little bit with the modern science. But there's nothing in the modern science that contradicts Stoic logic. It just builds on it a little bit. So that's as far as the logic is concerned. As far as the ethics, which is really the most important part, I think there is very little that needs to be changed. The only major thing, I mean, it still works very, very well, which is one of the main reasons why Stoicism has become so popular these days. It's the ethics that most people are concerned with. And that one still works, with one big exception. We really need to revise the Stoic concept of providence. So the Stoics thought that because the universe is a living organism endowed with the logos, with reason, then we are literally bits and pieces of that organism, right? Not metaphorically, literally. We're component parts of that organism, and whatever happens to us, it's not for our benefit, it's for the benefit of the cosmos, right? Epictetus presents this idea very nicely. He says at more than one point in the discourses, he says, look, you are like a foot that has to step into the mud. And if you look at this situation just from the point of view of a foot, isolated from the rest of the body, you'll think, this is disgusting. Why do I don't want to get into the mud. This is horrible. But then if you remember that you are a foot, which means you're connected to a body, and that your job, your very reason for existence is to bring the body home, and that includes having to step through the mud, if that's the case, then not only you are going to accept your duty of stepping into the mud, you're actually going to be happy about it. It's because it's the meaning of your life. You're doing what makes your life meaningful, right? So that's a beautiful view of things, but it's wrong because, as I said before, the cosmos is not a living organism, and so we're not its bits and pieces. So Stoic providence, which is directly connected to Stoic physics, doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because that aspect of Stoic physics doesn't work. So that one we need to change, and unfortunately, we don't have a hell of a lot of good ways to change it. The only thing that I can think of is that we have to drop the notion of loving your fate, amor fati, as Nietzsche famously put it. Loving your fate is just not a thing. It's not. Now, enduring your fate, accepting your fate, and reacting with equanimity, which are still Stoic things, yes, absolutely. Because what's the alternative? Your fate is your fate. So you only have two options. And here too, there is a wonderful metaphor that is attributed to Chrysippus. He says that we are like a dog that is chained to a cart, right? So the cart starts moving and the dog only has two options. Either one, just gingerly follow the cart and, enjoy the landscape and, then sniff around and stuff like that. Or drag himself on the ground and try to resist the cart. But the cart is going to go no matter what. And so if you do the second thing, if the dog does the second thing, all it's going to happen is that it's going to get bruised and it's going to hurt itself, and that's it. In the metaphor, of course, the universe is the cart, we are the dog. So we only have two options. You either accept whatever comes your way and try to enjoy it when you can, or you kick and scream and get upset, and then you still have to do whatever the universe decided to do, but on top of which you're hurting yourself, right? That part, I think, is still true. But the notion that Epictetus has, for instance, where he says, if one of your loved ones, like your your son or your wife dies, you should not be disturbed. And he's right. If the universe were a living organism and there was such a thing as providence, you shouldn't be disturbed, because they've died for a reason, to help the rest of the cosmos move along. And what better reason that could possibly be for somebody to die? So you should be fine. But unfortunately, I don't believe that. So that aspect of Stoic ethics has to go. But the rest of Stoic ethics is pretty much intact. I think the major changes are in the physics, that is, in Stoic science. The Stoics really did get a lot of things wrong. And that's not surprising, right? I mean, these people were alive 2,500 years ago when there was no scientific method, there were no microscopes, no telescopes, no radio telescope, nothing. So it's surprising that they got it as much right as they actually did. But major aspects of Stoic physics will have to go. And so the project would be a slight update in Stoic logic, very little update in Stoic ethics, but a fairly major update in Stoic physics.
What did they get right about the physics?
That's a good question. So, well, for instance, that everything is made of matter, or as we would say today, matter and energy, right? So there were materialists. So everything is made of matter. Everything that exists has cause and effect, has a power of cause and effect. So they believed in universal cause and effect. I think that's right as well. They got right the fact that we don't have free will. They didn't use that term, but in a deterministic universe, you don't have free will. You do have volition. They were what, from the point of view of modern philosophy, they were what we would today call compatibilists, meaning that they were people who thought that on the one hand, the universe is deterministic, therefore there is no free will. But on the other hand, your decisions are yours. And that sounds like a contradiction, but it's not, because what they thought was that we're not exceptions to the general rule of cause and effect. It's just that some causes are internal to us and some are external, right? And the internal causes include my brain and how it works. Our brain is essentially a decision-making, very sophisticated decision-making machine. That's biological machine. That's what it is. So my decisions are definitely mine, in the sense that they are generated internally to me by a particular piece of biological machinery that's mine and not yours or not somebody else's, right? So in that sense, they are ours. But because we live in a deterministic universe, we are not, in fact, morally responsible. One of the nice things that I like most about Stoicism is that there is no blame to be had anywhere, right? The Stoics say, don't blame other people, don't blame yourself. Just don't blame anybody. Blame is just not a thing. It's just not a useful concept. When you make the wrong decision and you act, quote unquote, wrongly, you do something, quote unquote, unethical, that just means your brain is misfunctioning. You're just making the wrong decision. So it needs to be fixed. That's it. It will be like, I'm looking at you through a computer, and all of a sudden my computer starts flickering and do things that it's not supposed to do. Okay, well then I'm not going to blame the computer. I'm not going to get upset with the computer and say, I'm going to put you in jail because, you're doing bad things. Like, no, I'm going to bring it to fix if possible, right? And if it's not possible, I'll have to live with whatever the computer does, try to minimize the damage, right? So that is the Stoic attitude toward decision making. Epictetus is very clear about this. He says, you should think of people who make bad decisions as if they were affected by a disease. And you wouldn't kill somebody just because they're blind and they cannot see. And somebody who makes a bad decision is essentially blind, cannot see. It's not his fault. It's just, it just happens. You just make a bad decision. So what you do with those people is you, first of all, make sure that they're put in a position not to hurt others, obviously. And then second, if you can, you help them. You help them regain their sight, right? You help them regain it. And if it's not possible, you just keep them there with, using compassion, not not hatred or anger or anything like that. I think that's a very beautiful view of how to deal with other people, and it does stem straight out of Stoic physics. It is one of the things that they got right about physics.
Yeah, I like that. I had a conversation a while back with Robert Sapolsky. He wrote a book called Determined, but he was saying kind of along the same principle. Is back in the day, if there was a woman that maybe had she was acting a bit strange, then they would have blamed her and called her a witch and then punished her. But as we develop, we go, right, she needs help. She's got a certain issue that needs help with. And I think this concept, this idea just leads to more compassion, more understanding.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. That's right. I mean, even people that do really, really bad things, like I'm talking psychopaths, right? Well, a psychopath is by definition somebody whose brain doesn't work very well. It's damaged. It's not a normal human being. It's a pathology, and therefore, as I said, your first priority is to make sure that they don't actually hurt people. And if that means you need to put them away in some kind of facility, well, then yes. But it's not because you're punishing them. It's because you don't want them to hurt others, right? That should be the first priority. But once you do that, you make sure that is the case. Then you should be really trying to help them. See if it's possible at all to recover them to society. That means that our entire system of course, of so-called justice is actually misguided from a Stoic perspective. We are into retributive justice. We punish people instead of rehabilitating them.
Yeah, I feel like there's a few, Norway comes to mind. There
are a few exceptions. Right, that's right. There are a few exceptions, usually in Scandinavian countries. They tend to be ahead of the rest of us. But in most places, especially in the United States, I mean, there is such a thing as the United States is the only. I'm pretty sure it's the only Western country that still has the death penalty, and the death penalty is nothing if not about revenge. It has nothing to do with recovering people. Literally, if you kill people, you're not going to recover them to society, and they have this bizarre thing. Where they actually allow and encourage families of the victims to be present at the execution, and they think, their excuse is that way the families have closure. I call bullshit on that. I think that's just straightforward revenge. It's like you want to see the bastard die, and it's a very unhealthy thing. I think it's incredibly unhealthy.
Yeah, I guess we haven't. In some ways evolved much since public executions where people would gather around to watch someone die. It's still the same concept, just a little bit more acceptable at the moment.
To be fair, most of the rest of us Americans have not evolved very much. But, you don't find any public executions in Europe anymore. And it has been that way for a long time. But in the United States, you still have executions and they are public. And it's like, that's weird. That's not a good thing.
No, I guess they still publicize sentencings and people getting life sentences, and I don't know what the purpose of that is. I guess it's the same concept.
I think the concept there is to reassure the public that justice has been done, and at the same time to act as a deterrent toward further criminal activity, right? Now, if you know that you're doing X and there's a good chance that you're going to spend 20 years in prison, then presumably you're going to think twice about before doing X. Whether that works or not, it's debatable. Actually, I mean, one of the arguments here in favor in the United States in favor of the death penalty is that it works as a deterrent, but studies show very clearly that it doesn't. There's no measurable deterrence effect that is being achieved. So that's an empirical question, of course. So I could change my mind if new facts come up. I'll change my mind.
Well, I guess it goes back. If someone does something because they've got a moral blindness or there's a defect in their brain, then I guess it doesn't really matter what deterrent you put in front of them.
Right. Exactly.
And
exactly.
then
the psychopath would do things no matter what, just because they're psychopaths. It doesn't matter what the deterrent is.
Something I'm really interested in, actually, and I've never looked into this, never studied this or asked anyone about this, is the interest that the Stoics had in Pythagoras.
Yes. I think it can be explained in the more general cachet that Pythagoras had in the ancient world. It wasn't just the Stoics who were interested in Pythagoras. He's mentioned the Pythagoreans are mentioned directly in the Meditations, for instance, by Marcus Aurelius. One of the exercises that Marcus does mention in the Meditations is this sunrise meditation, where you gather at the beginning of the day before sunrise, and you look at you contemplate the sun coming up. And why would you want to do that? Because that reconnects you with nature. That reminds you that you're part of a bigger whole, right? And he says this is something that the ancient Pythagoreans used to do. So it's not a Stoic invention. It predates the Stoics by at least a couple of centuries. In general, arguably the ancient philosopher that was most influenced by Pythagoras was actually Plato. Plato was very much into geometry and mathematics, and that's what the Pythagoreans were into. Allegedly, although we don't know whether this is true or not, but allegedly Plato's Academy had a sign at the entrance that said, you shall not enter unless you understand geometry. Right? So it was that important. We don't know whether the sign is real or not, the story of the sign is real or not, but we definitely know that Plato did insist on the study of geometry. In fact, was so influenced by the Pythagoreans and by geometers in general. There were several geometric schools in ancient Greece, that he thought that we could use that as a model to build a new philosophy. That is, he wanted to put philosophy itself on the same kind of rigorous footing as geometry. Obviously, that didn't work, but that was the idea. So it's not surprising then that the Stoics got influenced by the Pythagoreans, because remember, Zeno did study at Plato's Academy. This was after Plato had died. But so not only that, but Zeno also studied with the dialecticians and the Megarians, and both of those schools were influenced by the sort of research on geometry and mathematics. So it's not surprising that Pythagoras has that kind of influence. The Pythagoreans, I should say, the Pythagoreans more than Pythagoras, because we don't really know a lot about Pythagoras himself as an historical figure. I mean, he certainly existed. But for instance, it's very unlikely that he actually came up with what is today known as the Pythagorean theorem. Very likely it was one of his students who actually did that. And in fact, the Pythagoreans themselves immediately split into two major sort of subsects. One was called literally the mathematicians, and they were interested in mathematics and geometry. And the other one, the other school, was more mystical oriented. So they did use mathematical symbolism, but it was in the service of some degree of mysticism. And it sounds like Pythagoras was more inclined toward the second branch than toward the first one. Some of his students were definitely mathematicians. So it's a complicated and fascinating story. Pythagoreanism was the most popular philosophy in ancient Greece in the 6th and 5th century. So before the beginning of Stoicism. Eventually, and he peaked early and then eventually kind of disappeared. But at the peak, the Pythagoreans were actually also very politically active, which is another thing that the Stoics got from them, the importance of political activism. And in fact, there are stories about the fact that the Pythagoreans at some point were in charge of a number of Greek policies in southern Italy. So they were, literally running the place. And we also have testimony of at least a couple of cases where there was some kind of political coup or some kind of upheaval, and a bunch of Pythagoreans were killed as a result. and they were sent into exile. So it's Pythagoreanism has an interesting history of its own.
Whilst you was talking, I was actually wondering what was the importance? Why was there such high importance on geometry?
The importance of geometry was because the geometry was a very good example of how you could actually rigorously come up with answers to questions that could be demonstrated clearly and without any doubt, right? So the Pythagorean theorem is the Pythagorean theorem. That's it. There's no questioning about it. There's no, you cannot have your different opinion about the Pythagorean theorem. It's, if you understand the theorem, that's what it is. End of story. And so Plato at some point thought that you could use geometry as a inspiration for philosophy. Yet you could put philosophy on the same kind of rigorous standing that geometry was. So imagine if you could actually do a geometrical equivalent of philosophical reasoning, so that you come up with an argument, and the argument is that's it. It's not refutable. The conclusion is certain, and there's no discussion about it. That would be kind of interesting, but obviously that's not possible. So Plato failed in doing that. But the inspiration was because of the rigor of geometry and mathematics in general. This happened again later on in the history of philosophy. I mean, both David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, they used Newton as an inspiration for their philosophy, right? So they wanted to put their philosophy on the same sure footing that physics was, thanks to Newton and Galileo. So this thing has actually happened multiple times in the history of philosophy, until I think now finally philosophers agree that mathematics and science are just not a good model for philosophy. Philosophy is a different kind of activity. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I feel like that's when I'm thinking of Epictetus's writings or his words. It's kind of like sometimes it is like just keeps breaking it down, and then he'll come with an opposing argument and say, but what if this? And then and it does seem like an equation.
Yes. I mean, so philosophy is about, at least in part, is about building arguments, right? We said before that the Stoics were very strong in logic, propositional logic. So yes, you're right. Not only what Epictetus does, but also some of the stuff that Marcus Aurelius does clearly lend themselves to sort of formal argument, premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and then conclusions. But there is a lot more to philosophy than just the presentation of formal arguments, right? So that's why, of course, the emphasis on argumentation, on formal argumentation, is why Plato and Aristotle thought that it was possible to put philosophy on firm grounds like mathematics and geometry. But because philosophy relies on argumentation, but it's not completed only by argumentation. It's not just about arguments. Then there is a lot of other stuff that just doesn't. The geometrical model doesn't work. But yeah, ideally, of course, you do want to come up with rigorous arguments about things. Epictetus has this wonderful bit in the Discourses where one of his students says, why should I study logic? And Epictetus says, would you like me to produce an argument for why you should study logic? And the student says, yeah, please do. And Epictetus says, but if you don't know logic, how would you know if my argument was sound or not? Good point.
I really like Epictetus. I'm aware that at least at some point Epictetus was your favorite.
Oh yeah, he still is. Yeah.
Okay, right. That's good. Why is Epictetus your favorite?
To some extent, because he is so straightforward and no nonsense. You can read Epictetus and understand what he's saying without any background whatsoever in philosophy or in Stoicism. You can just look at it, what he writes, and he says, "Oh yeah, I get it." So one of the things that I appreciate is the no nonsense kind of approach that Epictetus brings to philosophy, but also that he's very practical. As he keeps saying to his students, if you're not here to actually put this stuff into practice, then you're wasting your time and mine. And that's kind of refreshing, especially coming as I do from academic philosophy in the modern sense of the term, where, if you mention practice, people look at you like you're Martians. Like, what do you mean practice? And, anything that is practical, it's not, by definition, it's not philosophical, according to some of my colleagues. And so it's kind of very, very refreshing. But fundamentally, the reason I like Epictetus is because I find his philosophy very compelling. The notion of the fundamental rule, or what is called the dichotomy of control, his notion of role ethics and how we should behave in life, his emphasis on cosmopolitanism. So all of those things are really Stoicism at its best. The famous three disciplines that he tells his students they need to practice: the discipline of desire and aversion, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. So all of those make the backbone of a very practical, very useful version of Stoicism. So, yeah.
Yes, you said in your book, you wrote at the start that there's like a shortcut. What are the exercises that you would shortcut to say, like, these are what you need to do? This is the most important things to do.
Well, at the beginning of the book, we come up with a short set of exercises that we think kind of give a sense of what practice in Stoicism actually means. And they're kind of meant to dip your toes into the practice and then decide whether you actually want to keep doing it or not. But as far as what I think and what I practice, the very first exercise in the book, which is about the dichotomy of control, is one of the fundamental ones. So this notion of getting into the habit of always looking at a situation and always asking yourself, well, what here and now is up to me and what is not up to me, and remind yourself that you should focus on the first and develop, acceptance and equanimity for the second one. So that's a crucial exercise. Some of the exercises on anger, I think, are important. Anger, of course, is an unhealthy emotion as far as the Stoics are concerned. And these days we find anger everywhere. And I think that we could all use a little bit more Stoicism in that particular department. Journaling is a fundamental exercise. That's basically what Marcus Aurelius does. The entire Meditations is essentially an exercise in journaling. And it can be done in a number of ways. Both Epictetus and Seneca actually give you instructions on how to do it. They ask you specific questions. They say, before you go to bed, ask yourself this and that and the other. So those are, and there is evidence from modern cognitive behavioral science that those exercises, especially journaling, done in that particular way, is in fact very helpful. That people learned a lot about themselves and they improve their awareness of things through that kind of exercise. So I would say those. I would also recommend an exercise, the exercise we were talking about earlier on from the Pythagoreans, the sunrise or sunset meditation, just to commune a little bit more with nature. Right now, I think the statistics is that close to 60% of the world population lives in cities. And that percentage is only going up over the next few decades. That causes a disconnect between us and nature. So we tend to think of ourselves as distinct from nature, which probably makes things like climate change worse, because it means that we keep engaging in behaviors that treat nature as something completely different, separate from us. So that kind of meditation is probably a good one. And then meditations on death, which there are different ways of doing it. Death for the Stoics is very important because it's death itself that gives meaning to your life, in a sense, because your life is finite, because it's going to end one of these days, and you're aware of it. Then that helps you pay attention to what you're doing and setting priorities. So there are different ways of doing the meditation on death. One of my favorite is simply to walk very slowly through a cemetery. To just pick a cemetery, go through it, and pay attention to the names and the dates on the tombstones. and remind yourself that these people were just like you and they're all gone. And one of these days you're going to join them. And so the question is, what are you going to do between now and then?
What does that do? Because I've explained this exercise to a lot of people, and they just initially think it's very morbid and something you don't want to think about. Why would you say to actually practice this?
Get over it. Get over the thing that there's this morbidity about death. I mean, one of the problems with the concept of death or the dying is that we tend to not want to talk about it and not want to see it, right? So especially in Western societies, particularly in American society, but in Western societies in general, we put the sick in a different place. We don't want it at home. We put the dying in a different place. We don't want to see them. We don't want to deal with them as much as possible. We don't want to talk about death. It's impolite to talk about death and as a topic of conversation. All of that is completely bizarre. Death is just as natural as anything else. It's not, and it's not something you can avoid. So, it's not like not talking about it somehow, precludes it from happening. It's going to happen, and if it is something momentous, important, and unavoidable, you would think that we want to talk about it. So the morbidity is just the result of a misguided attitude that we have, and so the Stoics would say what you do with misguided attitude is you correct them. And one way to correct them is to act the opposite. In fact, one of the exercises in the book, it's called act the opposite. And it's like, if you are averse to something, then make a point of doing it. This is something that, and so that you become less and less averse to it, right? So are you averse to talk about death? Then make a point of talking about it as frequently as possible, so that you get over your own aversion. This is actually something that works very well, according to, again, modern cognitive science. One of the standard techniques in cognitive behavioral therapy, which itself was inspired by Stoicism back in the 50s and early 60s when it started, is precisely this notion of exposure. So if you are, the way you treat, for instance, a phobia or a fear of something is by gradually exposing yourself more and more to things, to the thing that you're afraid of, right? And you do it in a controlled fashion. You don't just go out and do it, with no rhyme or reason. But for instance, one of my favorite examples is there's a thing that apparently that is some people have a phobia of buttons. So things on that we all wear without thinking about it twice, but some people are actually really scared by buttons. Well, that's obviously an irrational fear. It's nothing to be scared of or be worried about, and yet some people are. And so what the therapist does is exposure therapy. So they will pick a button and then on purpose put it, like 2 meters away from the subject, and then stay there for a few minutes and let's talk about it. And then the next session, they'll put the same button a little closer, a minute and a half, and they will linger there for more than, the time that they had the first time around, until eventually the patient is able to actually pick up the button and handle it physically, right? It takes a few sessions, but it works. It's kind of amazing. People get used to, they habituate themselves to what is called the stimulus. So in this case, if the problem is not a physical one, it's not a button, but is a conceptual one, it's like, oh, I don't feel comfortable talking about death. Okay, then that's a good reason to talk about it. But that doesn't mean you want to do it indiscriminately and all of the times. And you start small, right? And that is why, by the way, that's a good example of where journaling actually helps, because you write down in your journal a kind of a plan. You say, okay, I want to work on my aversion to talk about death. Great. So I'm going to start tomorrow. I'm going to talk about it with one close friend for 5 minutes. And then next week, I'm going to talk about it for 10 minutes. The following week, I'm going to talk about it not with a friend, but with somebody who I don't know that well and I'm less comfortable with, et cetera, until it becomes more a thing that you can deal with.
I'd just like to wrap this up with a question I ask everyone. It might seem like a strange question, and I feel like people might struggle to answer it, but hopefully it makes sense. I feel like in life, for our own unique experience, we all develop a thing, a practice, something that's very unique and niche to us that we do that's helped us through life that maybe we never share with anyone because it's too specific. Do you have anything like that you could share?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, I'm kind of surprised that that people might have that kind of thing. I mean, I do believe that we are fundamentally similar. Human beings are kind of, we would love to talk about how diverse we are and how unique, everybody's unique. Yes, everybody's unique, but in a trivial sense, in the sense that our DNA is literally not identical, from person to person, except of course identical twins, and even they actually develop differences during their lifetime. But fundamentally, we're the same. That is, we tend to be we're the same kind of animal. We tend to be worried about the same sort of general things, and we tend to react in pretty predictable ways. I mean, that's why psychologists are so good about describing human behavior. It's really not that complicated. So I'm surprised that somebody would claim that there are things that are absolutely unique to them. Of course, there are accidents of life that are unique to you, right? So your life is unique in the sense that a certain specific sequence of things happen to you that did not happen to anybody else. Sure. But I don't think that's of any kind of fundamental difference. It just happened that way, but it could have happened in a very different kind of way. So I tend to think of things that I do or practices that I engage in as potentially useful to at least some other people. Not necessarily everyone, because not everyone is necessarily in the same kind of general situation that I find myself right now. But no, I don't have anything that specific. In fact, it kind of, since I got into Stoicism, it's kind of the opposite. I get more and more interested in things that are applicable to more and more people, rather than that is specific. As I said, when somebody says, "Oh well, unique," I kind of laugh inwardly, and I say, "Yeah, sure," but not in a way that matters.
That's a good answer. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Massimo. I really enjoyed talking to you. I feel like I've learned a lot today, so thank you very much.
All right.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.